So Spurs are definitely going to be better next season. The question is, will they be good enough to challenge for the title? Now, in order to challenge for the title, Spurs have to do one very simple thing, and that is pick up more points. Now, let's have a think about what is required to challenge for the title in terms of points. So on the board in front of me, I've got the points totals for the Premier League winners for the last 10 seasons. And if we look here, the trend line starts off quite nicely. All of the teams winning the Premier League here are getting points totals less than 90 points. We then get to this watershed moment, which is the 15-16 season. That's the season when Leicester City win the title. And at that point, the traditional top 6 teams think, we can't do this. We need to sort ourselves out. We can't allow a team that were nearly relegated last season to win the Premier League with such a low points total. So you can see here, then we get this vertiginous rise as more money is pumped into the Premier League, and we get this era at the top here where Manchester City dominate, and then Liverpool join them to dominate as well. The expectation then will be that if Spurs are to challenge for the title this season, they're going to have to get points totals that are at least in the low 90s, if not the mid to high 90s. We can add a little bit more flavour to our data here by adding in the trend line for the second place finishers. Again, the trend lines sort of follow the same sort of pattern, but there are 2 seasons which stick out particularly. The first one is the 17-18 season. This is Manchester City's 100-point season. Manchester United comes second with 81 points. 19-20, similar thing happens, but this time Manchester City drop away and Liverpool win the title. This shows that the Premier League is not the Bundesliga. It's not the case that there's just one team who has to dominate, and if that team has a bad season, then another team can win the league with a maybe lower points total. If Spurs are to challenge, it's more than likely that they will have to get a high number of points next season. Let's add one final trend line in here. So this is Spurs season finishes basically, and their points totals over the last 10 seasons as well. You can see here middling results that work up into this crescendo under Mauricio Pochettino, get the second place in 16-17, but then you see this decline, this fall away here as the squad is allowed to run down a little bit. We culminate with these 2 seasons under Jose Mourinho, where Champions League football proves to be impossible, and then we come to 21-22 season here, the season just gone, and you can see the 4th place finish, but the massive gap between where Spurs are and where they need to be to challenge for the title. Now, before we move on, it is worth just talking a little bit about 17-18 season, because we've already said this is the Manchester City 100 points total season. We have Manchester United in second place, Spurs obviously in third here, but then we have Liverpool in fourth on 75 points on this line. That is interesting because that's a 25-point gap, but the following season that 25-point gap is reduced to simply 1 point. So it shows you that this kind of gap isn't insurmountable in terms of improving over the course of the season. And actually, if we look at some of the underlying data, we've got the 28 games that Spurs played under Antonio Conte. So already we're getting rid of the first 10 games under Nuno Espirito Santo, which went badly. Now there still is that points gap. You can see there's a 14-point gap up to Liverpool and a 17-point gap up to Manchester City. But as we've said, points aren't everything. It may be the case that teams are performing better than their points suggest. So analysts have developed this new metric called expected points. And what expected points does is it takes the underlying data from a game, runs it through models, and it pumps out a figure at the end which says, you would expect that this team would pick up this amount of points from this game if you were to play it hundreds of thousands of times. If we look at the expected points data over the course of that 28-game period under Antonio Conte, we can see that Spurs are roughly tracking where you would expect their points to be. So they picked up 56 points, you would have expected them to pick up around 55.25. So a small over-performance, but not too much. If we look at the other 2 teams, Liverpool and City have overperformed their expected points totals by much bigger figures. Now looking at the gap in terms of expected points, it's only about 10 points between Tottenham and Liverpool, and then about 14 points up to Manchester City. So again, we're just seeing areas where that gap actually might not be as big as it appears when you look at the points table. Now, the way that Spurs can start competing for the title is by not dropping as many points as they did last season. So let's just quickly look at the sorts of games where they were dropping points last season. So here we've got all of the games where City, Liverpool and Spurs dropped points. We've got red results, that's losses, blue results are draws. With Manchester City, you can see that there's 3 losses. Liverpool only have 2, but because Liverpool draw more games, that means that they finish with a lower points total than Manchester City. That's why Manchester City won the league last season. When it comes to Spurs, the first thing to look at is this big chunk of games in the bottom corner. These are the 5 games that were lost under Nuno Espirito Santo in the 10-game period that he had Spurs under his management for. And obviously you would expect that Spurs would be looking at this and thinking, already there's a lot of points available there for us to win next season, narrow our gap further. But actually, if you compare the games here that are lost under Nuno with the games that are lost under Antonio Conte, a few interesting things do start to emerge. The games that are lost under Nuno, with the exception of Crystal Palace, are teams that you would describe as being maybe top 7 sides, and you might expect Spurs to struggle in those kind of games. When we look at the games under Antonio Conte, what we see is actually the games that are being lost are the games that you wouldn't expect Spurs to lose. So games like Southampton, Wolves, Burnley, Brighton, those are games that Spurs would be expecting probably to win on balance. So it seems as though the shift from Nuno to Conte has solved some problems. That's how to beat teams at the top of the table. And we know that Spurs have been really good at playing counter-attacking football with a really fun front 3 of Son, Kulusevski and Kane. But they've replaced those teams that they struggled with before with other teams, and I think there's 2 main groups that we can talk about here. The first one I want to call smart pressing teams. So we've got Southampton here, 2 games where points are dropped. So clearly something that Southampton are doing is causing Spurs problems. And then we have Brighton down here as well. These are teams that press smartly and I think cause some kind of disruption to Spurs in their build-up. We'll have a look at that in a minute. The other group is these teams that you might describe as being more defensively minded, so teams who are going to sit deeper and deeper and prove to be really hard to break down as a block. So teams like Wolves, Burnley, and then you could throw probably Brentford in there. So 2 areas there which we can identify where on the field Antonio Conte can improve performances and pick up more points and therefore reduce the gap to the top. So let's go across to our tactics board and have a look at some of those areas that Spurs have been struggling with and think of ways that Antonio Conte can maybe get around. So here's the 3-4-3 that Spurs have played throughout Antonio Conte's time for the most part. We've seen already that really fun front 3 of Son, Kane, Kulusevski, and we've seen that actually Antonio Conte is really, really good at creating space for those 3 strikers to attack. The way that they do that is by building up from the back, dropping their centre-backs super deep here, and tempting the opposition out to come and press them, creating space in behind here, that now suddenly you've got players like Kane, Son, Kulusevski can now attack. So these players going deep, you may want Harry Kane to drop in, be a little bit more creative, pick the ball up and find these 2 players in wide areas. One of the things that Antonio Conte is famous for doing is generating these automatisms, which is patterns of play that are repeatable, that players can trust because they know that other teammates will be moving in the same sorts of areas, in the same sorts of ways, so they'll have more time to operate on the ball. So one of the most famous ones that you'll see is the ball comes out to Christian Romero, who's an excellent centre-back, both on the ball and off the ball. And what Romero is going to try and do is he's either going to be able to play the ball into Doherty, or maybe even shell the ball down the line into the feet of Kulusevski. Then we can see Spurs attacking into this space. One of the things that can happen here is that if teams do press them, there's an automatic pass here that can be played first time. So ball into Doherty, he can play a bounce pass into Højbjerg here, and then Højbjerg can play the ball down to Kulusevski. Now, if you play against teams that are smart at pressing, they're going to do their best to cause problems here. So we've already talked about Southampton. Southampton are obviously an aggressive pressing side, so what they're going to try and do is have a really high aggressive press. So when the ball is down here with Romero, you'll see the striker coming across here, you'll have the wide player pushing on the wing back, you'll have a central midfielder here, and you'll see all of these players pushing right up, making it really tough for Spurs to play these passes out. And if you can do that aggressively and enough, then you'll stop Spurs from being able to find those spaces in behind. So that's what Southampton did. Now there's another team who were a smart pressing team that we talked about that does things a little bit differently. So Brighton caused Spurs all kinds of problems later on in the season, and Brighton played a completely different system. They're not going to press as aggressively and high. They're going to have what's called a mid-block. They're going to keep Spurs at arm's length, but what they're going to try and do is they're going to force Spurs in wide areas to play the ball back into the middle and then play aggressive passes into their front 3, which they can then soak up. So let's say that Romero has the ball and we see the strikers pulling across, making it really tough for the build-up movement here to take place. Now the response from here usually is that Romero will play the ball into Eric Dyer, and then you'll see the midfielders trying to create space here for Dier to play the ball into these three players. And what Brighton were doing is, because they play with a back three, they can actually overload the midfield with an extra player, so that when Dier tries to play these passes into the feet of various players, you've got smart movements, players stopping those passes from actually coming off. So that's how smart pressing teams have caused Spurs problems. How do you solve them? Well, we've already talked about the £150 million that Daniel Levy has said that Spurs can spend this summer, and that's probably going to be the best way that Spurs can actually improve in those areas. If they can bring in better technical players in the build-up phases, then they'll be able to make sure that these smart pressing teams don't cause them as many problems. So we've got Ben Davies here, good solid player, but you might want a slightly more technical player in here, bring in a left centre back. We've already seen that Ivan Perisic has been signed. He's going to be an excellent addition, so you've already improved your wing back here, and then there's been talk of another right wing back coming in, maybe someone like Jed Spence. And by doing this, you're just raising the talent level, or the technical level in particular, of your players so that you can break presses better. Højbjerg and Bentancur, I think, are both really well suited to the Spurs style under Antonio Conte, particularly in the off-ball phases. You could probably improve them slightly as well technically, and that again would add you another level of ability to break presses. Now, as soon as Spurs are able to do that, able to break those presses, then there's going to be a situation where teams don't try and press them as high. So in this sort of situation, you'll see Spurs adopting a position really high up the field because the opposition are allowing them that space to move into. And we've already talked about the way that raising the floor of that squad for Spurs is going to allow them to attack better. So wing backs here, new right wing back, Perisic. We know Perisic is a great crosser of the ball. He is also very two-footed, so that will make things a little bit easier. And what they're going to be trying to do is find the ball in the wide areas, get the ball across, find potentially Harry Kane, and then potentially the goal. Now the problem here is that you have an issue with creativity. So when Spurs have a little bit more space, you use Harry Kane as your creative fulcrum, as we saw. He'll drop a little bit deeper and then be able to find Son and Kulusevski in front of him. The problem is, in these situations, you really want Kane to be in the box, off the shoulder of the last man, because he's a dangerous goal scorer, as we've seen. And so there's maybe an issue with creativity here as well. And I think the solution to that could be switching to a 3-5-2, taking out one of your front three. So let's say we get rid of Kulusevski in this situation and bringing in an attacking midfielder who can then float in between the lines and potentially break down this low block that is causing problems. And there's a reason why Spurs fans are so desperate to talk about Christian Eriksen, because that's exactly the kind of player that he was. So it's clear that Spurs have a real mountain to climb if they are to challenge at the top of the Premier League.